Greetings everyone, the sources of the UK Constitution. Now if you've watched the last video you should be aware what a constitution is, what the UK Constitution is, such as uncodified, etc. But you should still have a bit of a kind of a confusion as to exactly where you can find the UK Constitution, and that is what we're going to be clarifying in this video. Here it is. Okay, that's a different kind of source, but do make sure that you use the right spelling of the word source when talking about the sources of the UK Constitution. The correct spelling is up there. Now, after you've watched this video, I would suggest you go and do yourself some further reading, either from a revision guide or from a more challenging textbook. And in many ways, sources of the UK Constitution are all across the news at the moment. In September 2019, if you're watching it later, I'll be referring to some kind of stories. But questions about what the UK Constitution is, what is constitutional, and what is binding and what is not, is very relevant at the moment, especially where you've got prime ministers like Boris Johnson who are very much trying to stretch their power and to push to the limits what they can do to Parliament and what they can't do to Parliament. And the fact that the UK Constitution is vague, which is what we'll be discussing here, is causing some of these issues. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? That's up to you, but it is part of the reason for it. So here we go. Remember this from the last video. The UK Constitution is uncodified. Therefore, I am not going to be producing to you a document that says the UK Constitution on it and telling you all about it, because, as you should know from the last video and from your research, that means there is no single source. It wasn't created at one time and all put into one document. It's not entrenched, which means that I can't go, look, here's the UK Constitution and here are all the other laws we have, because that doesn't exist. It means that we're going to be finding it in multiple sources in multiple places, and whatever is there is going to be relatively simple to change if there is a will and a way. Now, I have got a video already on amendments for the US Constitution. Now, if you're in year 12, it might be a bit ahead, but you might want to go and have a look just to kind of see what the comparison is and the contrast is, because the way you change the US Constitution is incredibly difficult and requiring approval from huge amounts of the country, whereas here, you can more or less do it like that if you've got perhaps a majority in Parliament or enough kind of public will, really. So let's look at them in terms of the headings. Where can I find the UK Constitution? You can find it in the law, what we're going to call statute law. Some of the textbooks call this parliamentary law. It's all the same thing. It's laws that have been passed by Parliament, and you can go and read them in a book on law or in the various scrolls of the House of Commons, but they exist in laws. Then there's conventions, which is things that people have been doing for a while and therefore they continue to do them. Yes, it's as vague as that. They're probably written down in various books or textbooks, but they're not written down in laws. They have never been passed or not passed. They're just things that people do by convention. You might be thinking, hang on, I thought a convention was where people will go to a certain place and they do it together. Yeah, similar root of the word. They go and do it every year, and therefore it's tradition that they kind of do that convention. And by convention, people do certain things in Parliament as well. Very vague. Authoritative works. So this is not something that has been passed as a law, but this is written down. This might be a book that someone wrote back in the historical days, and it's kind of become like the Bible of a certain element of how the country is run. I'll be giving you some examples later. But imagine you wrote a book, and then everyone started following that book. And then over time, your book became the way things were done. And no one ever put that book into law, but everyone kind of understood that your book was the way that we did things. That's an authoritative work. And we'll give you some examples in a minute. Common law. Got a picture of a nice looking judge here. Now, this requires a little bit of understanding of the British judicial system. Basically, in the old days, judges used to go around and they didn't have a particular court, but the judge would go to various villages. We're talking a long time ago here. And when the judges would go around, they would pass rulings. And if one judge passed a ruling, then other judges were then kind of obliged to pass the same ruling as well. So there was kind of consistency across the legal system. And this is often known as common law. So it's not a rule that has ever been legislated by, like statute law, but it is a law that has been passed by a judge and therefore now must be followed by others. Unless, of course, it is overwritten by another judge or by a statute law. So it's not vague, it is specific, but in many ways it is changeable, and of course it is not democratic. It hasn't been voted in by a parliament. It is a particular judge's either interpretation of the law or a particular judge's decision as to what a certain right or decision should be. Then on top of this, we've got other historical principles and traditions, many of them involving the monarch and things like that. And lastly, this one's probably more similar to statute law. You've got foreign treaties. So this is not something that has been passed by Parliament, but it is an agreement that our country has made with another country, that it has been written down, it has been signed off, normally by the Prime Minister and various other ministers, and to an extent it is binding, and therefore it is something we follow. And we'll be covering some examples of that as well. So rather than me going, look, here is the Constitution, these are all the places that you would have to go to try and find out how our country is run and how what are the rules for the various parts of our government system. A lot more complex, a lot more vague, a lot more flexible, a lot more random in many ways. But you've got to think that our country's been functioning now for, well, over 1,000 years since kind of William the Conqueror, or maybe just less than 1,000 years. Whatever this big mess is, it clearly works. And if you're kind of a believer in tradition and maybe a bit conservative with a small c, you would probably be quite happy to kind of go, look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If this has worked, then don't worry too much about it. But if you're perhaps more liberal in your thinking, in terms of liberalism, then actually you would probably want to have very clear rights, regulations, systems of government, separations of powers, and you would be more keen on codifying the Constitution, which is why a party like the Liberal Democrats are far more keen on legislating and codifying things like constitutions than a party like the Conservative Party. Right, so let's take and break them down one at a time. Statute law. Note that extra T. It's not statute law. It's not someone posing and going, look, here's the Constitution. It is statute. This means written laws that have been passed by Parliament in the UK. Now, this is anything that the UK Parliament has passed is statute law. There is no difference between a law and a constitutional law, or a statute non-constitutional law and a statute constitutional law. So you don't pick up one of these statute laws and it says, this is a constitutional statute law. It's just all of the laws of the country. But some of them happen to be constitutional because they affect the way the country is run. Think back to the last video. What is a constitution? It tells you how the country is run. So any law that tells you how the country is run or defines the relationship between the various branches of government or creates an institution is effectively a constitutional law. But you might look at a certain law and go, is that constitutional or not? Kinda might be the answer. Whereas in America, you've got a very clear system of these are the constitutional laws and these are not. So there's a bit of muddy there. But let me show you some ones that are almost certainly constitutional. First of all, we've got the Human Rights Act 1998. This was where they took a whole load of the common laws that had been around for a while, like ones that have been done by judges for years and years, so the right for freedom of speech and the right to freely assemble and the right to protest and all sorts of things, and they took them all and they codified them. They put them into statute law. They wrote them down. They made them properly official. And this was as a public display of, yes, we believe in human rights. It was also to help the legal system, to make sure that there was a very clear understanding of these are laws which you cannot twist or change, and this is the standard to which we kind of expect. And it's pretty recent. You know, we're only talking kind of 20 years ago that this was actually properly put into law. That doesn't mean there weren't human rights before, but it means that those human rights were there more under kind of common laws or lots of different bits of statute laws over time. And it kind of shoved them all in together. So before the Human Rights Act, there was a law about women's rights or disabled rights or gay rights and things like that. And the Human Rights Act basically kind of went and took all these common laws and all these other statute laws and kind of shoved them all in together for clarity and purpose. Scotland Act 1998 created the Scottish Parliament. Well, that tells you pretty much how a country is run, doesn't it? Westminster gave away some of their powers or lent some of their powers to the Scottish devolved Parliament and the Welsh and the Irish to an extent, although created that regional assembly or regional parliament. We've then got, let's go back in the past a little bit, the Equal Franchise Act, 1928, giving voting rights to women and to men that were under a certain age and no longer had property. So it expanded the franchise. That's changing how the country's run. And also the infamous Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2010 or 11, it'll be around there somewhere, which was created when the coalition government came into power to try and ensure that they survived the full 5 years. Now you'll note that 3 of the 4 examples are fairly recent. That's not an accident. Britain hasn't had a lot of major constitutional change until the Blair government of 1997 onwards. There are some major events that take place. So you've got the Bill of Rights, and you've got the Parliament Acts, etc. There are some big ones, but they're really, really spaced out and they're major. We get a lot of constitutional changes will suddenly fly in once you start getting post the 1997 and the Blair government. So that's statute law. What others can you think of? There's loads more. Think of other laws that exist that affect and impact our constitution. See if you can think of 3 or 4 more before you move on. Pause the video, move on. No, wait, pause the video, have a think, unpause it, move on. We're going under the sea. Now, why are we going under the sea? Well, the nice thing about the statute law one is it's really clear. It's either there or it's not. It's either been passed into statute law and it exists and you can look at it and you can go, oh, look, there's a law that's probably a constitutional one, or it's not there. Now, but all of the others from this point on are murky, and that's why I've kind of put this picture here. They're open to debate. They're maybe even optional, which is crazy when you kind of come to them. But they're certainly not as clear as the statute law. The statute law ones, you've got to follow them. They've definitely been passed. But all of the others, you might start to go, well, is that an example of this or an example of that? And do we have to follow that? And what happens if people just don't do it? And yes, all of these questions are true and valid and real. So let's have a look into the murks, the underbellies of the other parts of the UK Constitution. First one is convention. Convention is simply, as I said in the previous introduction, things that people do because they've always done them and they think they're going to carry on with them. And if someone stops doing it, well, that wouldn't be very British, would it? Because, you've always done them. What? And, we believe we've done these things for years. What are you doing, man? You can't do that. It's convention. That is a part of the UK Constitution. And the whole Brexit debate, which has been going on now for whatever it is, 4 or 5 years now, is really putting a stranglehold on convention, because people are starting to ignore these conventions and people are going aghast of like, you can't do that. But you can, because a convention is not enforceable. It isn't written in statute. It's not a crime if you don't break it. If you break it, then, well, everyone's just very upset. But there's nothing that actually stops you from breaking a convention. Let me give you some examples. This is the Salisbury Convention. Now, I've got a little picture of the House of Lords here. Now, there's a tradition that says if a government is elected in the House of Commons and they have a manifesto is a document that says what that government will do. So let's say I'm going to be elected to be the next Prime Minister, and I've written in here that I want to raise taxes and I want to create more schools. Now, I've written that in my manifesto, and I've now been elected to government. So I have what's called a democratic mandate. I have permission from the people for my manifesto, which I have written, which is public. And as you probably know, the House of Lords has the power to block and delay my bills, just to stop them becoming acts. They can't stop them because of the Parliament Act, but they can delay and they can get in the way. But there is a convention called the Salisbury Convention that says, if it's in my manifesto and I have been elected, then they won't get in the way of it. So my new schools and my tax changes, they're not going to get in the way of that, because the Salisbury Convention says you don't do it. Now, what would happen if they did block it, or if they did delay it for a year? Well, nothing, because it's only a convention. But lots of people would say, but you can't do that because it's a convention. Now I'm not saying that a convention isn't powerful. I'm not saying that a convention isn't an important part of our constitutional system. It is. It's just that there isn't really a penalty for breaking it. But the power of convention is actually very, very strong. It is very unlikely, or would be very, very difficult for the House of Lords to break that convention, because that's what they've always done. Now, they did get close to breaking it recently over the Brexit issues. Theresa May had put in her manifesto that they were going to leave the EU and all these kind of things, and the House of Lords has been kind of stropping and causing various issues, and that's something we'll look at in future examples. I want to kind of tease out these examples in more detail and show you how you can put them into your essays. But I think you get the idea. They don't block things that are in your manifesto. Another one, collective cabinet responsibility. We're going to be talking about this a lot more when we actually get to talking about the cabinet and the executive. But in brief, if you're in the cabinet, so let's say I'm the education secretary or the minister for YouTube, and I want to disagree with the prime minister, to do that, I have to quit the cabinet. If I want to stay in the cabinet, I have to agree with the prime minister. So let's say I'm the minister for YouTube, and the prime minister comes out and says that he wants to abolish ballpoint pens, and I have a choice because I love my ballpoint pens. If I want to stay in the cabinet and have collective cabinet responsibility, I have to just go along with it. I might not have to go out in public and be like, I love this law, but I certainly can't go out and disagree with it. If I do want to come out and say, I disagree with this, the prime minister has gone wrong, I must resign. I must get out of the cabinet and go back to being a backbencher, which is exactly what Amber Rudd did less than a week ago. And in fact, loads of others have done. Boris Johnson himself did it over the Theresa May deal in Lancaster House, or one of the various speeches that she gave, or the Chequers. I think it might be with the Chequers deal. There's various variations of it. That's a nice phrase. So collective cabinet responsibility is a convention. Now, supposing I disagree with the prime minister and I stayed in the cabinet, what would happen? Well, the prime minister would have a choice about whether to kind of sack me or not. They might do, they might not. But by convention, that shouldn't happen. I should go. Can you think of any others? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Maybe have a discussion with your classmates about what else might be conventions. Authoritative works. Okay, so I described this one earlier. It's a book that someone wrote that has become, over time, the accepted way of doing things. It's written, but it's not statute. Here's two examples. Erskine May. Erskine May was the clerk of the House of Commons many, many years ago. You can see a little photograph of him here. He was the clerk of the House of Commons, and he collected all of the kind of the conventions and the way Parliament works and the systems and the things that should happen and the things that shouldn't happen, and he wrote them all down into a big book, and he kind of became known as Erskine May. After himself. I can't remember the actual title of the book. You're welcome to kind of look it up. Actually, no, I can remember it. It's called Parliamentary Practice, because it's on a poster in my room. It's called Erskine May's Parliamentary Practice, but it's actually just become known as Erskine May. And it's become the way Parliament works. It's never been passed into laws, but it's the way that Parliament works. Now, this came into the news really recently because in Erskine May, it says that the government cannot introduce the same bill to Parliament again and again and again without making significant changes. This is a tiny little line in Erskine May that more or less everyone had forgotten about until John Bercow, the Speaker, used it on Theresa May. If you remember, Theresa May was trying to put her deal through Parliament, and she put it into Parliament, and she got defeated by a huge majority. So instead of going, oh no, I've been defeated by a huge majority, I should go and change this completely or resign or something, she said, okay, vote again. So she put exactly the same bill through Parliament, and this time she'd lost by a little bit less. So she went, okay, vote again. And she tried to put it through again, but before she did, the Speaker came out, John Bercow, and said, hang on, Prime Minister, in Erskine May, it says that you cannot put the same bill through Parliament without significant changes. And it caused her a problem because she couldn't put it through Parliament. And the Speaker was very clear, you ain't putting this through unless there are significant changes or it needs to be a different bill. The idea being, we've already said no to this. We voted on this. You can't force us. By putting it through again and again, you're kind of causing a rift between Parliament and the executive. You know, we've had our say. Do something else. And that comes from Erskine May. That comes from Erskine May. Really nice, good example of how an authoritative work has had a constitutional change impact recently. Another one, far less famous, but for us politics students, it's quite an important one. These are the O'Donnell rules. 2010, there was no majority in Parliament. It looked like there was going to be a coalition, and the coalition was either going to be between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, or the Lib Dems and Labour. Mathematically, the liberal conservative one was the only one that worked. But how is this coalition going to happen? How are they going to negotiate it? How are they going to come to an agreement? So Gus O'Donnell, who was the head of the civil service at the time, not a politician, but a civil servant, sat down and he wrote how to make a coalition. And he kind of wrote a little guide of how it was to take place, and they became known as the O'Donnell Rules. So if we get a situation where a coalition government is likely to happen again, they will probably open up the O'Donnell Rules, and they will follow that authoritative work to see what the process is to create that coalition. Now, of course, none of these are legally binding. It's not statute, but it is stronger than convention in many ways because it is written. But perhaps not codified. So two good examples there for you to be able to discuss. Can you think of any others? There definitely are others. Google it, have a look around, but these two examples will probably sort you out. Common law, I already discussed in the introduction. This is the ones that come from judges and then have become part of the British legal system and therefore have become rights or rules in a certain way. Now, the Human Rights Act of 1998 or 9, I think it was 98, actually replaced huge amounts of common law. So common law is far less used than it used to be because over time, Parliament has slowly taken these common laws and put them into statute to make them more certain, to make them more defined, to make them more codified, to use that kind of phrase. Slowly over time, common law has become less and less important. And the Human Rights Act of 1998 really kind of not finished off common law because it does still exist, but removed a lot of it and transformed it into statute. But a lot of the Prime Minister's powers are actually still common laws. For example, the Prime Minister hiring and kind of the Prime Minister commanding the armed forces, their abilities to kind of call general elections, even things like proroguing Parliament probably go under the heading of common law. And one of the issues with this is that there is a kind of vagueness about what powers the Prime Minister exactly has. There you go, I said that sentence. Because a lot of them are there just under kind of common law, maybe tradition to an extent, maybe kind of customs, and then you're probably thinking, well, yes, okay, so what's the difference then between common law and convention? To which my answer would be, well, yes, exactly. Can you think of any others? Probably not. But if you can, let me know in the comment section. And then lastly, an even vaguer one. We've got just tradition. And here's one for you, the Queen's Speech. Once a year, I'll tell you why I laughed in a second. Once a year, Parliament closes down for a couple of weeks, and then they reopen, and the Queen comes along, and she says, hello, well, what my government is going to do this year is as follows. And she reads out a speech, except she didn't write it, the Prime Minister did. So when it's the Queen's speech, in fact, it's the Prime Minister's speech. But by tradition, the Queen will read it. And by tradition, she will do it once a year. Except when all the Brexit stuff was going on, Theresa May said, we aren't going to have a Queen's speech. We're not going to have this little break. We're just going to carry on right through. So she broke the tradition. And then Boris Johnson came along right now, September 2019, and said, we're going to have a Queen's speech, and we're going to have that right in the middle of these important Brexit debates. So I'm going to shut down Parliament for a couple of weeks, and then we're going to have a Queen's speech. Can he do that? I don't know, can he? And in fact, the courts are currently deciding whether he has the power to do it. At the time of making this video, the English High Court has just said, yes, you can do that, Boris Johnson. But the Scottish Court has just said, no, you can't do that, Boris Johnson, because you did it for underhand reasons. And on Tuesday or Wednesday, the Supreme Court is going to make a ruling about whether actually he can or whether he can't. And of course, the judges are making rulings on it. So that then means that this tradition is going to move into common law because the judges are now going to make a ruling on the tradition. And then at some point, it might become a statute law in the future, maybe one day. I don't know. So you can see how the British Constitution kind of works. In the previous video, I talked about it being evolving over time. Well, kiddies, it's evolving around you right now. Yeah. I hope that kind of makes sense. So the traditions and the conventions and the common law, they're kind of there until they're not there. And then they change and they evolve. So nice example there for you to write about. And remember, in politics essays, the more recent your examples, the better. So talking about this whole proroguing Parliament, moving of the Queen's speech, powers of the Prime Minister, it's up to date, it's all around you, learn it, understand it, write about it, get a good mark in the essay, thank me afterwards. Boom. Can you think of any others? Okay. So hopefully you've seen that all of these bits of the Constitution so far kind of goes in two halves, two sections. Let's not go halves. You've got statute law and you've got everything else. You've got the really, really clear ones, and you've got the ones that start to get more vague. Some are more vague than others. So authoritative works is far more clear than convention. Common law is probably more clear than convention and tradition. But then again, convention is clear, but it's just not binding. So you've got to think about how the kind of different words might work and kind of into play. But you've certainly got statute law and everything else, except my very last one, which is foreign treaties. Now, foreign treaties are documents which are signed by normally our Prime Minister and another country, and they are binding, unless, of course, you choose to get rid of the treaty. Now, if you've been watching American news recently, you'll know that Donald Trump has torn up lots of the treaties that he's made with various other countries. He's after getting rid of something called NAFTA, which is the North American Trade Agreement. Is that right? Google it, check if I've got that right. And he wanted to change an agreement he had with South Korea for terms of arms things. But we've got lots of foreign treaties as well, and they do affect how our countries run. Now, the big one is, of course, the EU. I'll explain Maastricht in a second, but by us joining the EU, that was a foreign treaty which pooled our sovereignty, as in we have a parliamentary sovereignty which has all the power, but we shared that sovereignty upwards, and we said, okay, if the EU makes a law, we will follow it, but it was voluntary, so we can abolish it, which is what we've kind of done by leaving the EU, if we leave the EU. Maastricht expanded much of that in terms of adding on kind of ideas of ever closer union. I think the more the free movement of people was in there, and other kind of aspects of trade and things like that. But these are written and they're clear. And we have to follow them. So they have become part of the UK kind of constitution. They don't necessarily affect how our UK political system runs, but they do affect the limits to power, which is part of the constitution. It does affect the relationship between institutions. So it's very, very important. Another one might be the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a treaty that we've signed that if one of our members is attacked, so countries like America and Britain and France and so on, if one of us is attacked, then we will all defend them. We will treat it as if an attack on one is an attack on all of us. And again, that's a written foreign treaty that we would be expected to follow. Of course, what would happen if we broke one of these treaties? What would happen if we scrapped them? What would happen if we just stopped following them? Would we get prosecuted? Would we get invaded? Probably not. There would certainly be consequences on the international stage. There might be a fine. There might be people might start ignoring other parts of the treaties. But so they're pretty powerful, foreign treaties, but they're not necessarily statute law in the same way. But it would be a good other bit of a good and interesting additional paragraph to talk about in an essay to kind of bring in this idea of foreign relationships as well. So there we go. The sources of the UK Constitution, the beautiful and wonderful mess that is our UK system. That works, but in many ways it's not very clear, and it's always up for debate, and it's always interesting to learn about. Hope you found that useful. Please give the video a like if you liked it, and if you've got any questions or if I've made any mistakes or you've got any better examples, then do stick them in the comment sections for other students to see. All the best.